adage, we do not negotiate with terrorists. I thank the chairman and the committee for their work, and I urge an A vote on my amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'd just like to advise him that our side of the committee especially enthusiastically endorses your amendment.
I appreciate the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. You know, today is actually my one-year anniversary of being sworn in to this Congress. It's hard to believe it's been a year. But one of the things I came to Congress to do was to really move us towards ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while we look towards the 11th anniversary of Operation Enduring Freedom, I believe it's necessary to reflect on the staggering human and economic costs this country has endured over the past decade. Since 2001, we've spent nearly $635 billion on the Afghanistan war. Under FY 2012 figures, this equates to an average of $8.8 billion a month, $2 billion a week, and nearly $300 million a day. With what it keeps to cost to keep this war going for a week, we could hire 45,000 more construction workers to help repair and build our own crumbling infrastructure. With what it costs to keep this war going for one more month, we could hire over 250,000 new teachers, nearly enough to hire back all of the teachers and public schools officials who've lost their jobs during this great recession. And while these figures seem astounding, they don't begin to compare to the human toll that this war has taken on our active service members and military families. Last October, on the weekend of the 10th anniversary of this war in Afghanistan, I visited Arlington West in California, an incredible memorial to the men and women who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's truly a moving experience walking through row after row of crosses in the sand at Santa Monica Beach. As of today, 2,041 U.S. soldiers have been killed in Afghanistan and over 12,000 have been wounded. And while many of us talk about these figures here on the House floor, I know many of us have even more personal experiences with families who have suffered loss or illnesses or injuries of their loved ones. Fortunately, I've been to Walter Reed twice in the last 6 months, and I've seen the evidence of the sacrifice that we're asking these young men and women to bear. And I think all of us should take the time to walk the halls of Walter Reed and see the full cost that this war has taken. My own cousin, a young man of 26, was only in Afghanistan 3 months, and he was shot in his leg. It's unclear whether or not he'll get full recovery of his leg. Last week, I visited one of my former employees in the city of Los Angeles whose son, Ben, was in Afghanistan, re-enlisted 3 times to go back. Unfortunately, this last time, he's lost now both of his legs. And his future, his family's future, has changed forever. You know, when you walk the halls at Walter Reed, you're made to remember the mothers bearing the crosses of their children, armed with only the memory of the love and loss of the unique responsibility that we all have to the fallen. You're reminded of the men and women who are still here and of the battles that they're going to have to fight long after they hang up their fatigues and come home. You're reminded of the struggle shared by the families, the mothers, the fathers, the sisters, the brothers, the sons and daughters of these veterans who bear the seen and the unseen scars of 4, 5, even 6 tours of duty. These scars are most evident in the recent news that 154 active duty service members have committed suicide in the first 150 days of this year. This is nearly 1 per day, a heartbreaking statistic that brings into stark relief the terrible toll of nearly 11 years of war. Mr. Chairman, we need to bring these troops home, and that's why I support this amendment that provides for the safe and orderly withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan and to help bring this war to an end. A decade at war is too long. I want to thank Congresswoman Lee for raising this incredibly important issue, and I urge my colleagues to support this effort and help bring the troops home. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. What purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
It's Lee 140.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee of California. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. The total amount of appropriations made available by this act is
Mr. Chair, I ask for unanimous consent that the amendment be considered read.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed of. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues in offering an amendment to set Pentagon spending levels from the 2008 financial year adjusted for inflation, or at $500 billion. I'm offering this amendment for one simple reason. The bloated Pentagon budget must be addressed if we are serious about solving our nation's deficit. And quite frankly, our real national security is about rebuilding our economy. It's time to use these tax dollars to create jobs here at home. It's time to rebuild America and also to provide for the health and economic security of our brave troops and the communities that they live in back here at home. Even with this modest cut, and it's very modest, $19.2 billion, the Pentagon base budget would still be, mind you, $500 billion, excluding war funding from Afghanistan, far outpacing any other nation in defense spending. Americans across the country have been forced to cut back, and many are barely able to make ends meet, while Pentagon spending has doubled over the past decade. The United States spends as much on its military as the next 14 countries combined, and all but 3 of these are close allies. Americans believe no federal agency should be immune from cuts, including the Pentagon. In fact, the average American would pursue a much larger cut of over $100 billion, according to a poll released earlier this week by the Stimson Center. Some have argued that defense cuts will result in job losses. The Pentagon, quite frankly, is not a jobs program. And even if it were, defense spending creates fewer jobs per $1 billion spent than investing in other sectors, education, health care, clean energy, or even tax cuts. The bloated Pentagon budget has been immune from oversight and scrutiny for too long. We couldn't even pass my amendment yesterday calling for an audit of the Pentagon. This really has resulted in unbalanced spending, where nearly 60 cents of every discretionary dollar now goes to the Pentagon. If we are serious about addressing the deficit, we must take reasonable steps to rein in Pentagon spending. My amendment makes modest cuts to defense spending while protecting our active military personnel and retirees from misguided efforts to cut their compensation and health care expenditures by prohibiting the additional cuts from coming from active duty and National Guard personnel accounts from the Defense Health Program. And let me repeat, not a single penny would come from active duty and National Guard personnel accounts or from Defense Health Programs. President Eisenhower famously said that the United States should spend as much as necessary on defense, which we all agree with, but not a penny more. At a time when American families, businesses, and government agencies are facing budget cuts and tightening their belts, the Pentagon should not be immune from the need to justify its expenses and guard against waste, fraud, and abuse. So I am proposing a very modest proposal. Over the course of a decade, it would equal less than $200 billion. $200 billion. The Bowles-Simpson Commission outlined $750 billion in suggested defense cuts in the next decade. President Reagan's Assistant Secretary of Defense, Lawrence Korb, has proposed $1 trillion in cuts to the Pentagon over the next 10 to 12 years. As I said, the average American would cut 18% of the Pentagon budget, or a little over $100 billion. So finding $19 billion in savings for next year is a very modest first step after an unchecked decade of runaway Pentagon spending. While many Americans would support a larger cut, This is a common-sense amendment to change the direction of Pentagon spending towards a reasonable level aligned with actual threats to our national security. So I hope my colleagues, many of whom speak out here on the House floor frequently about the importance of addressing our deficit, will support this amendment. If we are really concerned with the deficit, then vote for this amendment. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this is another amendment that slashes large amounts from our overall national defense appropriations bill. I would say that this subcommittee is not adverse to reducing defense spending where we can do so without having an adverse effect on readiness or without having an adverse effect on our troops, their medical care, their family. And I understand the gentlelady does protect some of those issues in her amendment. But this committee has already proved that we are willing to cut defense. In the last 2 fiscal years, this subcommittee, in a bipartisan basis, a bipartisan way, was able to reduce by $39 billion. And we did so very carefully by looking at every account, every project, every place that we could find weakness in the spending, in the contracting, in programs that were terminated or about to be terminated. And we can do that. But just an across-the-board cut is not smart. Here's what could happen. We could actually, with this amendment and this reduction, we could require that we reduce or cancel training for troops returning home from the battlefield, or cancel Navy training exercises because they're running very tight on funding already, or reducing Air Force flight training, or delaying or canceling maintenance of aircraft, ships, and vehicles. All of this relates to readiness, to make sure that the men and women in the military are ready, that they're trained properly, that they have the equipment, and that the equipment is ready. Now, something new here, interesting for this year, CBO, everyone understands that CBO is a nonpartisan, non-political organization, have just issued their analysis of the Department's future year defense programs, the FYDP, and determined that Department plans will actually cost $123 billion more than they actually project, which means what they say we will get for the money, we won't get that for the money. So further cuts would make it very difficult to meet the requirements of the Department of Defense, the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force. We just don't want to do that. And this is not the only amendment. We've dealt with this amendment, similar to this amendment, numerous times yesterday, and I expect that we will again numerous times today. This is not a good amendment, and it's one that I would hope that the members would reject. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise? Gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to co-sponsor this amendment offered by my friend from California. As she clearly stated, this amendment would cut $19.2 billion of Pentagon spending and bring the overall spending down to $500 billion, while at the same time protecting our troops and their medical needs. Even with this cut, the $500 billion that remains amounts to a generous appropriation for the Defense Department. With this cut, the Pentagon budget would still be greater than the next 10 countries' defense budgets combined. That's right. Military spending from China, Japan, Germany, the UK, Russia, India, France, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil combined would still trail our United States military Pentagon budget by hundreds of billions of dollars. I just don't understand how someone can stand here and say $500 billion isn't enough. How many more outdated Cold War weapons systems do we need? How many helicopters with unreliable mechanical systems do we need? How many fighter jets causing pilot blackouts do we need? How many more private defense contracts do we have to pay and overpay? At some point, we have to say, enough is enough. It's time, Mr. Chairman, for a reality check. It's time to accept that we spend too much on our bloated defense budget. I mean, ask any other department or agency if they would make do with $500 billion. I think we all know what that answer is. They'd be delighted. So I urge you all, vote yes. Bring some sanity back to our budget. I yield back.
Yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Alabama rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Brooks of Alabama. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used by the Department of Defense or a component thereof to provide the government of the Russian Federation with any information about the missile defense systems of the United States that is classified by the department or component thereof.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representative Mike Turner, Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee's Strategic Forces Subcommittee, and Representative Trent Franks, co-chair of the Missile Defense Caucus, for their support of this amendment. This amendment prohibits the administration from using funds to share United States classified missile defense information with Russia. It is similar to an amendment which passed with bipartisan support in the House version of the fiscal year 2013 National Defense Authorization Act. In light of recent statements by President Obama that he wanted, quote, more space, end quote, from the Russians in regards to missile defense, and his statement that he would, quote, have more flexibility, end quote, on this issue after the elections, I am concerned, Mr. Speaker, that the United States' critical hit-to-kill and other valuable missile defense technology may become pawns in a political chess game of appeasement with the Russians. Statements by Russian Chief of General Staff Nikolai Makarov have increased my concern. In reference to the United States' desire to strengthen our missile defense sites in Europe, General Makarov threatened the use of military force against the United States, declaring, quote, a decision to use destructive force preemptively will be taken if the situation worsens. Mr. Chairman, if Russia's defense staff is willing to blatantly threaten the United States, why should the United States hand them the keys to technology that gives America's warfighter a decided advantage? The danger to national security is obvious, but there is more to this picture. The Congressional Research Service estimates the United States has spent approximately $153 billion on missile defense. A vast majority, roughly 90%, was spent on hit-to-kill technology. It makes no sense to spend $153 billion of taxpayers' money on advanced weaponry just to give it away. This amendment builds on a letter that had broad bipartisan support in the United States Senate and was signed by 39 senators in April 2011, expressing concern about giving the Russians sensitive missile defense data and technologies. These senators were concerned, as I am, that the White House must not use America's missile defense technologies as a bargaining chip in negotiation with Russia. This amendment helps the United States lead the world in missile defense technologies, preserves investments of billions of dollars, and ensures the viability of current and future missile defense technologies. Mr. Chairman, at this point, I yield 2 minutes to my colleague and good friend, Congressman Turner from the great state of Ohio.
What? The gentleman may yield, but not specific amounts of time. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out the importance of this amendment and also reiterate that this amendment says that classified information about our missile defense system should not be allowed to be provided to the Russians. We have two areas of concern. Obviously, one, Iran and their growing ICBM threat to the United States. I previously wrote a letter with Chairman McKeon to Secretary Panetta asking about specific information for the rising ICBM threat with Iran. I'd like this to be included in the record. And the second aspect is that we're all aware that the President is currently in negotiations on a secret deal with the Russians. We saw that in the open mic discussion that the President was having with Medvedev in South Korea. Where he said he wanted greater flexibility till after the election. Some of that flexibility should not be disclosing classified information concerning our missile defense system to the Russians. This amendment would say, Mr. President, you won't tell us what your secret deal is, but that secret deal better not include sharing classified information of the United States with the Russians about our missile defense. And I also want to enter into the record May 23, 2012 letter that I had sent to the President asking him to disclose the terms of this secret deal. Mr. Brooks' amendment is very important because it says, Mr. President, even though you won't tell us what the secret deal is, we will not allow you to exchange classified information and weaken the security of the United States. I yield back to Mr. Brooks.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This is the gentleman from Florida rise.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this actually may be the most critical amendment that we will consider on this bill today. There should be no secret deals on our missile defense with the Russian president or any other person not involved with the security of our own nation. This amendment precludes that. Mr. Brooks has pointed it out extremely well, and Mr. Turner has certainly made a very strong case. But let me add, our national defense interests have got to be our interests, not somebody else's. Our national defense investments must be made based on what is the threat to our nation. And dealing with missile defense especially, the Iranians have just shown a massive arsenal of missiles, short-range, medium-range, and some long-range capability. Now, those missiles would have the ability to target our troops wherever they might be in the region, in the Persian Gulf region. They could even reach to Israel, one of our very best partners and coalition. We just can't let this happen. We can't let anyone make a secret deal with a Russian president on missile defense. The threat is too great. The threat is growing, not only from Iran, but from North Korea. The North Koreans have invested a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of technology in developing their missiles. And I don't suspect that they are for peaceful purposes. And we have to be always on guard that we protect Americans and our interests and our troops, wherever they might be, from hostile attacks by somebody's missiles. So this is a critical amendment, and it is important that we have a very large vote and send the message we are not going to toy with the defense of our nation, especially missile defense. I yield back.
Yields back. What purpose is the gentleman from Washington rise?
I rise to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
And, you know, frankly, we don't have any problem with this amendment. I would be very surprised if the administration would give any classified information to the Russian government. Now, maybe the gentleman knows something that I don't know. But, and I understand that there was an inadvertent comment that, you know, suggesting that after the election there may be a better opportunity to work between the two governments. You know, those things are said at times. But I have no personal information that anyone is saying that we're going to give them this information. So I personally think it would be a mistake to give it to them. Unless it was declassified, so the American people would know what the information was. But in this case, just to be sure, I'm willing to go along with the gentleman's amendment and you know, we have to be very careful here with classified information. There's no question about that. And there's been some concern expressed about classified information being released to the public, which is, you know, is another questionable activity. But I yield back my time and will support the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman yields back. The question is for what? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise for the purpose of a colloquy regarding an amendment that I had intended to offer relating to military families. And I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman strikes the last word and is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, our military personnel have access to great health care through TRICARE, but in certain cases, and many would be surprised to learn this, TRICARE does not cover every health service, and this is comes into play sometimes with children of military families with special needs. There is also a circumstance when someone in the military is separating from the military, but they don't have retirement benefits, and their family, their children, may not have access to health insurance. I ran into this in a case back home in Tampa, Florida, at MacDill Air Force Base, not unlike many of our colleagues here who participate in forums for veterans and job fairs and the like. And the military health folks were they didn't know a lot about Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program, whether it applied to military families that they talk to all of the time or those families that are separating from the military and are no longer covered by TRICARE. So we tried to investigate this with the Pentagon a little bit, but they were not able to clarify anything for us. And I've done a little research. There was one report entitled Medicaid's Role in Treating Children in Military Families. And that report advised that 1 in 12 children from military families rely on Medicaid for some health service. And for children with special needs in the military families, 1 in 9. I was surprised to learn that, frankly. Plus, we have many that have served in the military, have come back from Iraq or Afghanistan. They have a lot of questions about what it means for them finding a job, finding coverage for their family as they move on in their lives. So I had intended to offer an amendment that simply clarified the fact that nothing prohibits DOD from providing that information at a job fair, a health fair, or advising military families that the Medicaid coverage or the S-CHIP coverage could be an option. So I'd really like to work with Chairman Young, the Department of Defense, Ranking Member Dix, so that our military families don't have to worry about health coverage, whether they're in the military, they have children with special needs, or they're separating from the military, and they just simply need answers to questions about where they can turn. I'll reserve the balance of my time. Or I'll yield to the chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the senator for yielding, and I want to thank her for the attention and the hard work that she does to ensure that our military service members and their families have the very best information and resources regarding health care. That is only fair. One of our highest priorities has always been to take care of the health of our men and women in uniform and their families. So I thank the gentlelady again, my neighbor in Florida, for her advocacy on this issue, and guarantee that we will be very happy to work with her and the department to make sure that all relevant health care information is available to our service members, our retirees, and their families. And I thank the gentlelady again.
Well, and Mr. Chair, I thank the chairman, and this is especially meaningful coming from Chairman Young, who has been, no one has been more attentive to military families, our service members, no matter what service, no matter their veteran status, than Mr. Young, my colleague and friend from Florida, and I thank the gentleman and yield back my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Speaker, I move to strike the requisite number of words and enter into a colloquy with the gentleman from Florida.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Ask the gentleman if he'd be willing to enter into a colloquy.
I would be happy to yield to my colleague, the very distinguished gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As Chairman of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, I've taken an interest in the use of our nation's spectrum resources by both federal and non-federal users. Spectrum is becoming increasingly important as our nation's needs for mobile communications grow. Unfortunately, however, demand is quickly outpacing the supply of spectrum. The U.S. Department of Defense is a large user of spectrum. An efficient use of spectrum would therefore not only greatly benefit our country in terms of technological and economic development, but also help our military in conducting its critical mission. Recent discussion of spectrum policy in Washington has turned to ways that the government and non-governmental users might share spectrum to benefit both. It's come to my attention that the work of the Department of Defense, through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Joint Program Executive Office, Joint Tactical Radio System, and other programs, has been examining some of these sharing technologies, but with mixed results. It's my belief that Congress would benefit greatly from a report on this research, and I would suggest the Department of Defense draft such a report that details the status of its work on cognitive radio, dynamic spectrum access, software-defined radio, and any other spectrum sharing techniques and technologies. I'd like to ask for your support, Mr. Chairman, and assistance in working with the Department of Defense to get additional information on the types of technologies under development and production, how much has been spent to date for these efforts as well. In addition, I believe that a clearer understanding of the efforts being pursued by the Department of Defense and the associated organizations for joint spectrum management technology developments, what has been deployed and what future investments will achieve is important and should be pursued, and we should fully understand what they're doing.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if the gentleman would yield, I would say to him that today's spectrum is a commodity, and the efficient management of that commodity is critical. I agree that understanding the Department of Defense's plans and budgets for research and development and deployment of these capabilities is critical. I look forward to working with Mr. Walden and the Department of Defense to understand the technologies and techniques being employed to improve government spectrum efficiencies. And I thank the gentleman for raising this important issue.
Well, and I thank the Chairman for his work on not only this issue and working with us on this, but also your terrific dedication to the country over the years, and especially in moving this legislation forward. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, Lee 138.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee of California. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following.
I ask for unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The Lee, Van Hollen, and Smith amendment would limit Department of Defense funding to the amount authorized under the Budget Control Act of 2011, resulting in a $7.6 billion reduction in spending from the level authorized by the Appropriations Committee. This amendment is co-sponsored by my colleagues, Armed Services Ranking Member Adam Smith, Budget Committee Ranking Member Chris Van Hollen, Representatives Amash, Blumenauer, Clark, Johnson, Nadler, Polis, Schrader, Stark, Welch, and Woolsey, among others. As you know, Mr. Chair, last year Congress passed the Budget Control Act, which put in place spending caps on discretionary spending. Despite these statutory limitations, the Appropriations Committee set overall military spending billions of dollars above what the Pentagon requested or what was agreed to under the Budget Control Act. A deal is a deal. While many of us did not support the discretionary caps under the Budget Control Act, our amendment simply brings Pentagon spending in line with the law. Again, a deal is a deal. It does this while protecting our active duty military personnel and retirees from misguided efforts to cut their compensation and health care expenditures by prohibiting the additional cuts from coming from active duty and National Guard personnel accounts or from the Defense Health Program. Let me repeat, not a single penny would come from active duty and National Guard personnel accounts or from Defense Health Programs. The Pentagon budget already consumes almost 60 cents out of every discretionary dollar we spend, and adding billions of unrequested dollars, mind you, unrequested dollars at the expense of struggling families during the ongoing economic downturn is wrong. Once again, I just have to remind us yesterday of an amendment that was struck down, made out of order, that we still can't even get an audit of the Pentagon. And here, once again, we're going against the law of the land and violating a deal and asking for more money. Outrageous. At a time when American families, businesses, and government agencies are facing budget cuts and tightening their belts, why shouldn't the Department of Defense be asked to become more efficient and eliminate wasteful programs? While many of us would support a larger cut, this is a common-sense amendment to keep spending in line with what was agreed to last year. Remember, a deal is a deal. I hope my colleagues, many of whom speak here on the floor frequently about the importance of addressing our deficit, will support this amendment. So I ask my colleagues, if we are really concerned with the deficit, then vote for this amendment. This is money the Pentagon did not ask for, and it does not need of it. Some of us really do believe that your word is your bond. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Florida. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, first I would like to say that I really respect Ms. Lee's tenacity and her determination. There's no doubt that she's sincere, but I just disagree with her amendment. Actually, except for the numbers that have changed, this is basically the same amendment that has been offered before, even today. And so rather than repeat the arguments, I would just say the arguments are the same. This is not a good amendment, and I would hope that the membership would oppose this amendment as we have others similar to this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Speaker, we have actually completed our withdrawal from Iraq. We are on our way to withdrawing from Afghanistan. There is not a strategic need to increase the base budget for the Defense Department beyond the BCA Budget Control Act agreement. Our own military leaders have acknowledged our debt and deficits are the largest national security threat that our country actually faces. We need to be building on the fiscal foundation the BCA laid in order to provide for our children's future and the military they will need to defend their freedoms. Sticking to the BCA framework is our strategic priority. We should take a moment to remember where we were at this time last year. There was a real threat of government and economic shutdown due to the approaching debt limit. In the very 11th hour, we passed the bipartisan Budget Control Act to forestall a sovereign debt crisis by cutting $900 billion from the deficit and agreeing to cut another $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. Even still, our national debt has increased by $1.3 trillion since we came to that agreement last August, and in part, this is due to the failure of the Super Committee to reform entitlements in our tax codes. In the coming months, we need to finish the job we began with the passage of the Budget Control Act, reforming entitlements and instituting comprehensive tax reform, as suggested by the Bowles-Simpson plan, is no longer an option but a national necessity. Changes scheduled to go into effect in January would harm the economy and the middle class while proving ineffective in true deficit reduction. Backpedaling on the BCA is irresponsible. By holding this body to the bipartisan law we passed last August and reducing our debt by reducing the underlying bill's appropriation by a mere $7.5 billion in Washington, D.C. terms, the amendment before you today will enhance our national economic security. We need to stick to the spending caps and move on from the FY 2013 appropriation process so we can work on getting the next framework put in place to responsibly address what has become known as the fiscal cliff. The American people, businesses in this country, deserve certainty about their future. We need to do right by them, avoid a crisis of our own making, and lay the groundwork for restoring our economy and getting hardworking Americans back to work. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
To strike the requisite number of words, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to first thank my friend Ms. Lee for bringing up this important amendment. She knows so well that the less experienced people in this body have had with the military, the fiercer they are. And that goes to the Republicans wanting to exceed their own funding cap in the Budget Control Act by $8 billion. It's a moderate amendment to bring us back under the Budget Control Act. It's the 12th year that we've been fighting and funding a war in Afghanistan and that area, and there's no peace. There's nothing, no stability. The war in Afghanistan has basically contributed to our instability. Nothing's happened over there. By 2001, we'll have spent $600 or $700 billion on this Afghan war alone, and the Defense Department appropriations bill wants another $600 billion. Republicans like to talk about entitlements like Medicare, driving the debt. Well, let me tell you, defense spending has become just as much of an entitlement with a team of lobbyists and members of this body that are more interested in protecting defense contractors than protecting our country's health, education, and economic growth. This bill ignores administration proposals to delay or terminate military programs while providing funding instead for weapons that the Department of Defense doesn't want, doesn't need, and won't work. Apparently, funding wars and weapons instead of better health care, education, repairing our infrastructure are more important to the Republican majority than all other issues. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment and start reining in our out-of-control defense budget. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very proud to join with my colleague, Ms. Lee from California, and Mr. Smith, the ranking member on the Armed Services Committee, in support of this amendment. And this amendment is, in fact, different than every other amendment that has been offered on this bill. And this amendment is very simple and very clear in its purpose. It's to make sure that this Congress complies with the Budget Control Act agreement that was set by this body on a bipartisan vote just last year. I would just refer my colleagues to the Budget Control Act and refer them to Section 302, Enforcement of Budget Goals. It's right there in plain English what the 050 number will be, the defense appropriation number will be. That was a Budget Control Act that was supported and voted on by the chairman of the Budget Committee, by the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and by the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and by the chairman and the ranking member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. In fact, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Rogers, said last year when we passed it, and I quote, "Tough choices will have to be made, particularly when it comes to defense and national security priorities, but shared sacrifice will bring shared results." He went on to say the Appropriations Committee has already started making tough decisions on spending and will continue under the spending limits and guidelines provided in this bill, unquote, meaning the Budget Control Act. That was August 1st of last year. The chairman of the full committee, full appropriations, was right last year. But the bill that's coming to the floor today is in violation of that bipartisan agreement. And as a result of that violation, while the defense appropriation bill exceeds significantly what was requested by our own Defense Department as what was necessary to meet our national security needs, because this bill dramatically increased that level above what was requested. The reality is the other bills that are coming through the Appropriations Committee are taking very deep cuts to education, deep cuts to health care programs. In fact, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Dix, described that Labor H bill as one of the most partisan bills that he's seen, and it's true. And that is a direct result of the fact that this bill that's before us today dramatically exceeds the Budget Control Act agreements. Now, Mr. Chairman, I would just refer the body to the statements made by Admiral Mullen recently, who of course was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, pointing out that our military strength depends on our economic strength, and our economic strength depends on our long-term fiscal health and the soundness of our fiscal policy. And I quote Admiral Mullins, who said, "Our national debt is our biggest national security threat." He went on to say, "Everybody must do their part." He said, "We can no longer afford to spend taxpayer resources without doing the analysis." This is Admiral Mullen. "Without ensuring every dollar is efficiently and effectively invested. We can no longer go along with business as usual if we are going to get our fiscal house in order." That is why this body, on a bipartisan basis, agreed to the Budget Control Act. And so it's very unfortunate that this bill now comes to the floor in violation of agreement, in violation of an understanding that in order to get our fiscal house in order, we had to make tough decisions on defense and non-defense alike. And by violating the agreement in this regard, what the committee is saying is they're willing to make really tough decisions. In fact, they're making irresponsible decisions with respect to the non-defense domestic spending. And I think we doubt we'll even see a Labor H bill on the floor of this House. It's so bad. And the reason it's so bad is because, in part, that Budget Control Act was violated and so much was added to the Defense Department, again, as my colleagues have said, more than requested by our military leadership, more than requested by the Defense Department. I agree with Admiral Mullen, who said we all need to share in this responsibility. I agree with what my Republican colleagues said just last year when we passed the Budget Control Act. Let's stick to an agreement and let the people know that when this body comes to an understanding after hard-fought compromise, we stick with it for the public good. And I thank the chairman and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
May I have a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman?
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to engage Chairman Mr. Young in a colloquy, if he will so engage.
Gentleman strikes the last word and is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I commend you and your committee for your hard work putting together this bill. The efforts by your committee and your staff to provide our warfighters with the tools they need to keep our nation secure are our first priority, and I thank you for your service in doing just that. I applaud your work also to mitigate risk associated with shrinking budgets, and I believe this bill shows your leadership to make tough decisions to fund our Department of Defense at the appropriate levels, even during this time of fiscal austerity.
Gentleman yield. I want to thank him very much for the comment.
Yes, sir, yield. All right. Mr. Chairman, I would also like to thank you specifically for your work addressing the wasteful pursuit by the Department, specifically the Navy, to stand up an alternative energy industry. These efforts go against the primary mission of the Department and are a colossal waste of taxpayer money, especially as we are scrubbing every penny inside the Pentagon. The Navy claims that pursuit of green fuel source that is produced in the United States would help protect it from price shocks and volatility within the oil markets. I've yet to hear an argument that supports how spending on average $26 a gallon for biofuels will protect our fuel budgets when we could be paying $3.60 a gallon. This argument simply doesn't add up. Prices, Mr. Chairman, would have to rise 8-fold for this equation to work. The Navy claims that development of biofuels will limit the number of deaths associated with fuel convoys in theater. Yet this is a specious argument. Biofuels will still be needed, convoys will still be needed to haul biofuels across dangerous areas to supply our needs, just like conventional fuels, and if they're less efficient, more convoys would in all likelihood be needed. The Navy also claims that buying biofuels and sailing their green fleet will end up saving American taxpayer dollars and ultimately lead to our military to energy independence. Throughout hearings in the House and the Senate Armed Services Committee, witnesses failed to offer any verifiable analysis that shows the cost of achieving this goal or when these goals can be achieved. Mr. Chairman, time and time again, with this current administration, we've seen instances of short-sighted, unrealistic expectations like this and its sister project of Solyndra at the Department of Energy, where venture capitalists are making a fortune off frivolous spending of taxpayer dollars on projects that belong in the private sector. The Department of Defense should be in the business of prosecuting wars and keeping this country safe, not wasting dollars on the pursuit of green fuel. I would argue the Department leaders should focus on buying the cheapest, most readily available fuel, which keeps our ships steaming and our planes flying. And I yield to the gentleman.
The gentleman yield. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for yielding, and I want to appreciate the gentleman's attention to this matter, and I support his efforts to prioritize spending within the Defense Department. I look forward to working with him to ensure that our scarce defense dollars are spent in a responsible manner, and I thank the gentleman for raising this issue.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Kucinich of Ohio. At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following new section. Section, none of the funds made available by this act may be used for the administration of the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery for the student high school testing programs.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Just so you know, and I want the chairman and the ranking member to know, in offering this amendment, it's not my intention to wipe out military recruiting. It's very important for people to be able to serve our country. It's an honorable profession. It's essential to America. What this amendment is about really is about upholding the right of parents to be able to determine whether or not their young person should have to take a test that would be given to them under the auspices of the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test. This is a test that is administered annually to 1 million military applicants, high school and post-secondary students, but it's more than just a test. Here's the kind of information that students who take this test divulge: Social Security number, gender, race, ethnicity, birth date, statement of future plans, and most significantly, their aptitude in a battery of subcritical tests. Now, if you ever wanted to make a case for the danger of big government being able to reach in to schools, think about this. You've got the largest organization in the government administering tests to high school kids and basically get all the information they want about these young people, and without their parents' consent. I have a problem with that. And we all should have a problem with that. Now, if someone can tell me that you'll fix this and provide for an opt-in or opt-out, or tell me that, you know, Dennis, you're right, any young person who could end up in military service, their parents ought to consent to whether or not they should be able to take the test and or whether the results of the test should be released. This is about privacy, it's about parental rights, and it's also about not letting big government become Big Brother, gathering information about our children at a very early age in order to have some higher purpose. Might be very altruistic here. We've got to be very careful about this system we've set up. This Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test is administered in recruiting centers. That's true. Fine. But it's also offered to high schools and post-secondary students. And according to the Pentagon, Career Exploration Program is designed to help students explore civilian and military careers. But the rise of this test in high schools has led countless students and parents to feel that they're being unfairly, potentially illegally, and oftentimes unknowingly recruited. The Department of Defense claims it's just a tool to screen students' enlistment eligibility, determine their interest and skills for non-military careers. But more than, Mr. Chairman, more than 90% of the scores being sent are sent directly to military recruiters. So it's obvious this is a recruiting tool. Fine. How about letting the parents know about it? How about giving parents a choice? Because most of the time you're talking about somebody who's under 18 years old. So, you know, I don't oppose military recruitment. I want that understood. But I am concerned that this test is being administered to kids in our public schools in a way that circumvents parental consent. The vast majority of students think they're taking the test and that it's required by their high school. Parents aren't informed their children are given a test. Why? Because their consent isn't required. Let's get the parents in on this. Now, you know, my dad encouraged me to be in the military. I had a heart murmur. I couldn't serve. All my brothers and my sister did. But you know what? We had some feedback with our parents about this. You give a kid a test, that puts that child on a track to military service. Parents don't know about it? Are you kidding me? Parents have a right here. And we have to restrain the impulse of a big government organization to gather information about these kids that ordinarily the government would never be entitled to. So I want to make sure that, that my friends in majority and my friend who's the ranking member understand that, you know, my amendment in no way stops consenting adults from pursuing a career in the military or from taking a test at a recruiting station or processing station. It doesn't prohibit military recruiter presence in our schools. We dealt with that and No Child Left Behind. You know, I was on the other side on that, but my amendment doesn't stop that. But it stops the administration of this test in the schools so it can't be used as a recruiting tool disguised as a test that targets children who are legally too young to consent to a career in the armed forces.
Gentlemen, what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. This amendment would basically prohibit funds from being used to administer the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery test. This amendment would negatively impact both the education and recruiting communities. This test is administered free of charge on a voluntary basis. It's on a voluntary basis to high school and college students as part of a comprehensive career exploration program. This program integrates student aptitudes and interests to help them explore post-secondary opportunities, including college, technical school, and civilian, as well as military careers. As education resources grow together, many schools rely on this free test to provide a valuable career exploration experience, and we as a nation benefit from this test. Through this amendment, the gentleman would effectively prohibit high schools from offering this test, which would be unfortunate, and we are strongly opposed to the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman from Florida. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I take this time to advise members of something that they might be exposed to here shortly. Recently, I had an opportunity to experience what I call an ambush journalism on an issue that I really found it hard to believe that this investigative reporter would raise the issue. He was very upset because of the amount of money that we spend to return our killed in action heroes from Dover when they arrive in the United States back to their families at their home base. I was really shocked that that would be a concern to anybody, because I believe that those heroes should be treated with the utmost of respect and that I told this distinguished gentleman that I would do everything that I possibly could to make sure that the proper respect and dignity was awarded these heroes as their remains return home to their families. I explained the law. This gentleman thought that the Congress actually set the schedules, decided which airplanes to fly the soldiers back home on. I explained the law. I explained that was not the case. I explained that the Pentagon had a lot of people who did administrative things like that, including scheduling. I just expect that many of you might also face this same investigative reporter and ask the same question. And I just want you to be aware that that is the issue. I don't understand it, why anybody would want to deny a hero killed in action the dignity and the respect as he returns home to his family. It is just exasperating to me, I would say that, Mr. Chairman, and I just wanted members to be aware you may be faced with this very same question, this very same issue. And I hope you're not, but you might be, and I bring this to your attention just in case. Now, I yield back my time.
Mr.
From Washington.
I move to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I have had a chance to talk to the distinguished chairman